Good afternoon once again, and thank you for joining this last lecture in the PCMA series. And my paper will focus on the Western Thebes and the landscape where ancient Egyptian tombs, temples, roads, quarries, and desert paths were gradually reinterpreted by late antique monks. The title of the paper, From Tomb to Hermitage, is therefore meant quite literally. I will ask what it meant to transform a funerary monument into a place of not only as an act of occupation, but as a strategy of adaptation, transformation, and reuse. The first part of the talk will set the scene. I will try to make a very, very brief introduction to Egyptian monasticism. Then I will move towards the meanings of desert, mountain, necropolis in late antique Egypt, and finally outline the development of the monastic landscape from the 5th to 10th century. The main part of the lecture will then focus on MMA 1152 and 1151 excavations, where we can observe reuse at the scale of a single tomb complex. Western Thebes lies on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor and covers roughly 100 square kilometers. Its eastern edge was not simply the river itself, but the cultivated zone between the Nile and the desert. This distinction matters because the monastic landscape developed in the tension between two different environments: the fertile, inhabited, administratively controlled valley, and the dry, rocky jebel, with its pharaonic tombs and temples. In Egyptian tradition, Thebes was Waset. In Greek and Roman administrative language, it was associated with Diospolis Magna, while the broader southern region became known as the Thebaid. In the late antiquity, several episcopal centers existed in Upper Egypt, including Koptos, Kos, Ape, and Hermontis. Western Thebes belonged to the Hermontide nome, and was closely connected with Jeme, the Christian town that developed inside the pharaonic temple complex at Medinet Habu. Egypt is often described, after Herodotus, as the gift of the Nile. For the history of Christianity, however, Egyptian monasticism has sometimes been called a second gift of the Nile. Western Thebes makes this phrase very concrete. The same environmental contrast that shaped ancient civilization also created the conditions for monastic life. When Greek-speaking communities entered Egypt, they brought with them the word oros, meaning mountain. In the Egyptian context, however, this term came to refer not only to a rocky mountain, but also to the jebel and the desert associated with it. Since cemeteries were located in the desert, rather than in the damp and valuable cultivated land, oros could also evoke the necropolis. Later, with the development of monasticism, oros acquired yet another meaning: a desert zone inhabited by hermits, small ascetic clusters, and monastic communities. This semantic shift is important. For a monk in Western Thebes, going to the mountain could mean going to the desert, to the necropolis, and to the landscape already saturated with older religious and funerary meanings. The model of withdrawal, anahoresis, was introduced by Antony at the end of 3rd century, later known as Antony the Great. According to tradition, he first lived as an ascetic among people, then moved farther away to the tomb, then to an abandoned Roman fort, and finally to a cave near the Red Sea. This trajectory is crucial for understanding Western Thebes. The tomb was not merely a convenient shelter. It was a part of a broader movement towards anahoresis, a going away from the temptations offered by society and civilization. The choice to shelter in the tomb was not simply practical. The Apophthegmata Patrum preserve many stories in which tombs appear as places of spiritual trial. Spending a night in a closed funerary space among mummies and the material traces of an older religious world could be understood as a test of faith and courage. For a pious monk, such place was not neutral. It could contain mysterious hieroglyphs, image of animal-headed gods, bodies, funeral equipment, and scenes that belonged to a religious universe Christianity was actively condemning. To settle in a tomb was therefore to inhabit a polluted space. It was a literal and symbolic confrontation between new ascetic life and the memory of ancient necropolis. Before moving into the chronological overview, I'd like to pause briefly on terminology. In modern scholarship, we need these categories in order to describe and compare the evidence. But in late antique sources, the terminology was often more flexible. A monasterium could simply mean a place where monks lived, even the dwelling of a single monk, while a cenobium implied a community living together under a shared rule. Laura usually refers to a semi-anachoritic arrangement with individual hermitages connected to a central place. The word topos is even broader. Literally, it means place, but in Christian usage, it could designate a holy place, a monastery, a church, sanctuary, a less clearly defined monastic foundation. This means that the names used by monks were not always identical with the categories we apply today. For example, a site could be called Laura in the text, while in its architecture and organization suggested what we would describe as a cenobitic monastery. For this reason, the chart shown here should not be read as a rigid typology of ancient terminology. Rather, it is an analytical overview of the functional categories that can be recognized in the archaeological and textual record of Western Thebes. What is immediately striking is the dominance of the hermitages. This does not mean that Western Thebes was only a landscape of solitary monks. Alongside hermitages, we also find monasteries, topoi, lauras, churches, etc. In other words, the monastic landscape was not uniform. It combined ascetic withdrawal with communal organization, production, communication, and interaction with the lay world. So when I speak of Western Thebes as a monastic landscape, I mean precisely this: not one type of institution, but a dense and varied network of spaces, functions, and communities distributed across the necropolis. The 4th century is central for the history of Egyptian monasticism, but it's not yet clearly visible in the archaeological record of Western Thebes. Antony is said to have gone to the desert at the beginning of 4th century, at the time where, according to the life of Antony, there were no yet monasteries in Egypt, and monks did not yet know the Great Desert. The first Pahomian monastery in Upper Egypt was founded around 323, and the term monahos, meaning monk, appears in the documentary source for the first time 1 year later. At the same time, older cults still functioned in Egypt. At Deir Bahari, devotees of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, and Imhotep still left Proskynemata as early as 4th century. And the latest hieroglyphic inscription invoking the Nubian god Mandulis at Philae dates to the end of 4th century. The Christian transformation of the landscape was therefore not rapid. In Western Thebes, in the 4th century remains more a horizon possibility than a clearly documented phase of occupation. From the 5th century onward, anchorites began to settle in Pharaonic tombs and other desert locations in several parts of Western Thebes. The pattern is significant. We do not see a sudden mass occupation of the center of the necropolis. Instead, the early sites appear on the margins or in the selected peripheral zones. In the northern part of Drab el-Naga, where the monk Paul probably settled before the later monastery developed around his memory. Near the entrance to the Valley of the Queens, where the Lara of Deir Rumi emerged on the ruins of Roman sanctuary. In the area of Kola el-Hamra, along the New Kingdom processional road toward Malkata, and in the Middle Kingdom tomb MMA 1152. One important early foundation also needs to be mentioned here, the monastery of San Foibamon on the Rock. It lay far from the cultivated land at the Nile in a difficult desert setting surrounded by high cliffs. Its location required considerable sources, and life there must have been demanding. Although it was once dated to the 4th century, the ceramic evidence suggested later, probably 5th century beginning. This fits better with the broader pattern visible in Western Thebes: cautious, selective, and spatially meaningful occupation rather than an uncontrolled spread of monks across the whole necropolis. Between the 6th and 8th centuries, Western Thebes became a monastic city spread across the necropolis. Small hermitages grew into larger establishments. At Drab el Naga, the monastery of Paul developed with workshops, school, and cemetery. The congregation of San Foibamon moved from the remote desert foundation to Deir Bahari. On Sheikh Abd el-Gurna, the topos of Epiphanius grew around reused Middle Kingdom tombs. Nearby were the monastery of Syriacus and the Laura of Apaseverus. In the Theban valleys and quarries, monks left dipinti, graffiti, and traces of temporary or permanent occupation. Bishops found refuge in tombs, monks traveled and exchanged goods, and ostraca show constant communication. This is why I prefer to speak of strategies of reuse rather than a simple occupation. Reuse involved architecture, economy, mobility, memory, and social relation. By the late 8th century, many monastic sites in Western Thebes disappeared from the written record and archaeological record as well. The monastery of San Foibamon is last securely attested in 786, together with its last known superior, Apasurus. Other communities, the topos of Epiphanius, the monastery of Syriacus, the Laura of Apaseverus, the Hermitage in MMA 1152, the topos of St. Mark, and the monastery of San Isidore the Martyr in Deir el-Medina were also abandoned, although the exact sequence is difficult to reconstruct. The monastery of Paul survived longer, probably until the turn of 9th and 10th century, and we had a chance to listen about it in detail on the previous seminar given by Ina Eichner. Yet abandonment did not mean erasure. Some former monastic sites became places of local devotion. Later, visitors left inscriptions on the walls. So the landscape did not stop being meaningful. It changed its mode of use. So this broader context brings us to the central question of the paper. If Western Thebes was a landscape of reuse, how did reuse actually operate at the scale of one tomb, one hermitage, one community? I will now turn to MMA 1152 and 1151, where we can observe the transformation of a Middle Kingdom funerary complex into a late antique monastic space for architecture, stratigraphy, and material culture. The site had been already recognized as an example of monastic reuse by Herbert Wilnock in the early 20th century during his missions under auspices of the Metropolitan Museum of Arts at the beginning of 20th century. He mapped these two tombs as sites 7 and 8. The Polish excavation began here in 2003 under the supervision of Tomasz Górecki, the former assistant curator of the Faras Gallery at the National Museum in Warsaw. His sudden death in 2017 abruptly interrupted a project that he had intended to bring to completion in the following years. In 2024, PCMA decided to renew the project for the two final fieldwork seasons in order to conclude the work that he had begun. I had the pleasure and responsibility of directing these final seasons. At the same time, I would like to underline that the excavation strategy and the primary archaeological interpretation, and especially the pottery analysis, must be credited to Tomasz Górecki and his team. My role has been to organize his archival documentation, bring it into line with current documentation standards, and revise or supplement it where the new evidence or new recording methods made this necessary. I am also responsible for preparing the final synthesis of the work that was done by Górecki. This case study is therefore also a study in archaeological inheritance, how to return to an unfinished excavation archive, how to make it usable for publication, and how to integrate new field observation with the work already done. As the person tasked with continuing Górecki's work, my first responsibility before returning to the field was to immerse myself in the project archive. Most of the documentation had been digitized and was kept in PCMA archives, while another part remained at the National Museum in Warsaw. And obviously, I could easily consult it because I work here as well. The sheer volume of material produced by Górecki and his team is overwhelming, and its systematic revision is still in progress. One of the first challenges was to decipher Górecki's highly individual system of notes and abbreviation. I had known him personally. We had worked together in Marea Philoxenite in Egypt, and this familiarity with his working habits helped me to some extent. In his unpublished field diaries, for example, reference to a mysterious amphora X appeared repeatedly. Only after rereading his reports and field diaries, comparing them with the pottery drawings, did I realize that this was the African transport amphora of probable Tunisian origin discussed in his final article that was published post-mortem in the Polish Archaeology journal in 2017. This small identification has proved important for reconstructing the site stratigraphy, which is often recorded in the greatest detail not in the published reports, but as in this case, in the field notes. The pottery archive presents a similar challenge. Only a small proportion of the drawings was digitized and included in the final article. More than 3,000 drawings remain to be processed. Górecki also used a very particular set of abbreviation to describe vessels, which differs from the terminology normally used by other pottery specialists. Beyond Górecki's own documentation, I also had to trace former members of the expedition, and I recovered studies already completed on individual categories of finds. Luckily, I was able to retrieve information even from specialists who had long since retired or left archaeology. This includes, for example, the meticulous work of Christine Hochstrasse-Petit, the ethnoarchaeologist who studied the organic materials from Gurna. At first, we feared that her documentation had been somehow lost, but her handwritten notes survived. So for anyone considering abandoning handwritten field notes altogether, please do not. One never knows how valuable they may become in the future. Bringing together the archives and reconnecting with former team members allowed me to prepare a preliminary proposal for the final site monograph, which will include contributions from these specialists. The volume is planned for publication by Brepus in the Warsaw Studies in Archaeology, and we expect to complete it by the end of 2027. With this brief explanation of the documentary landscape of the project, let's return to the physical landscape of Western Thebes. MMA 1151 and 52 were cut in the upper part of the rocky limestone massif of the Libyan desert. Their entrances are about 40 meters apart. These two tombs form the core of the monastic complex, although the whole site also includes two smaller features: an unfinished tomb in the southern part of the courtyard, now used as a tomb magazine, and several meters down toward the Valley of the Eagle, the small, shallow, and unfinished tomb 4S, which may have been used by the monks as a temporary shelter. The complex lies approximately 70 meters above the cultivated fields, and the deposition is crucial. It is removed from the main zones of settlement, but it's not visually or socially isolated. From this area, one can see parts of the Theban monastic landscape, the direction to Deir al-Bahari, the monastery of San Foibamon, the area of Deir al-Medina, Gurnet Murray, the Ramesseum, the edge of Franges Hermitage in TT29, and of course the whole Sheikh Abd el-Qurna hill. And let me briefly take you there. So this is the quite steep path leading to the Hermitage, which is located here. And when we turn right, there is a Deir Bahari somewhere over there, and Abu el-Naga. This is Sheikh Abd el-Gurna. The Ramesseum. Here are the cultivated lands and with the panorama of Ramesseum. And here we have Gurnet Murray, and behind this massif is Deir al-Medina. So and here we see the part of the wadi leading to the Valley of the Eagle. Distances measured along paths rather than in straight lines are particularly important in this study because they tell us how long it would take a monk or messenger to carry a letter, a request, or an object from a community to another. The Hermitage was therefore marginal in topography, but integrated very well into a network of movement and communication, which is also proven by the content of the Ostroka, which I will be mentioning at the last part of my presentation. The position of the tombs also explains their archaeological value. Many Theban tombs had long, complicated post-antique biographies. In the modern period, especially with the development of the village of el-Qurna, some tombs were incorporated into the domestic architecture, used as storage rooms, animal shelters, or otherwise affected by the modern occupation. Families built houses beside or above selected tombs, and the tombs themselves could become part of the household space. This is precisely the kind of later reuse that often makes the archaeological interpretation of monastic remains very difficult in this area. MMA 1151 and 52 are different. Their location high on the slope and away from the main zones of modern settlement meant that they were not overbuilt by the 19th or 20th century village houses. They also lay off the main paths, which reduced the chance that objects were accidentally brought there by later travelers or displaced from other contexts. With the exception of clearly pharaonic material and a few modern intrusions, the objects from the Hermitage can therefore be associated with its later users, the monks. This is rare in Western Thebes. At the same time, the site was and is not easy to study. It is rocky, partially eroded, and did not offer the kind of neat stratigraphy one might expect at a larger settlement site. For this reason, the pottery was documented through a combination of surface collection points, which were marked with numbers by Górecki. The order of this numbering, however, does not reflect the stratigraphical relations between these trenches, but it can be traced, but it can be still traced on the drawings. So we may now connect each almost of the documented piece of vessel with this numbering system, but unfortunately, not all is traceable. Nevertheless, thanks to the careful collection and recording of pottery fragments, Górecki was often able to join sherds belonging to the same vessel, even when they had been found in widely separate contexts. This made it possible to trace the movement and dispersal of individual vessels across the site and to identify connections between deposits that might otherwise have appeared unrelated. Before discussing the monastic adaptation, it is important to look at what the monks actually inherited. MMA 1152 was originally a Middle Kingdom tomb cut into the upper part of the rocky slope. Like other tombs of this type, it consisted of an open courtyard, a long entrance corridor, and an inner chapel connected with the vertical shaft. However, the monument was never fully completed. Its orientation is also significant. MMA 1152 is broadly aligned on a northwest-southeast axis, with the courtyard and the entrance opening more towards the east in the direction of the Nile Valley. The neighboring tomb MMA 1151 is useful as a comparison because it had a very similar form and was also left unfinished. The two tombs belong to the same Middle Kingdom horizon and were cut in the same rocky slope, but they were not arranged in the same way. Their axes are almost perpendicular to one another. While MMA 1152 follows a northwest-southeast axis, the other one follows a broadly northeast-southwest axis, and its courtyard had a much more northern exposure with a view towards the Valley of the Last Mentuhotep. So the Valley of the Last Mentuhotep is here. Here we have the wadi leading to the Valley of the Eagle. These differences changed the entire macro environment of the two tombs. MMA 1152 was much better illuminated in the first part of the day when the sunlight entered the courtyard and reached far into the corridor, probably almost to its end. Later, in the hottest hours, it was protected from a direct overheating. At the same time, however, the large dark opening of the corridor must have been clearly visible even from a distance. The later erection of the tower partially shielded this entrance. Even today, when one stands in the vicinity of the modern German house and looks from the right angle, the light brown color of the tower's mud brick masonry blends perfectly with the surrounding rock and obscures the entrance. One may therefore wonder whether the position of the tower was entirely accidental. The entrance to MMA 1151, by contrast, remained naturally hidden and required no comparable monastic alteration. It could not be seen easily either from the Nile Valley or even from Sheikh Abd el-Gurna itself. Its northern exposure also meant that it was much darker throughout the day. Its corridor was probably poorly lit, perhaps even permanently shadowed, but it would also have been cooler. This comparison shows that reuse was not simply a matter of choosing an available tomb. Even two neighboring and broadly similar monuments could offer very different living conditions. Light, shade, temperature, visibility, and access all shaped the way in which a tomb could be transformed into a hermitage. The Christian phase was not the first afterlife of the tomb. Archaeological material indicates that funerary cults may have continued after the Middle Kingdom, and the tomb was reused for burials in the Third Intermediate period and at the beginning of the Late period. Human remains, coffin fragments, faience, beads, shaptis, and elements of funerary equipment show that MMA 1152 had already accumulated a complex biography before the arrival of the monks. For the monastic phase, this matters because the monks were not simply entering an abandoned architectural shell. They were entering a place marked by former ritual activity. The transformation into a hermitage therefore involved a confrontation not only with Pharaonic architecture but also with the material remains of earlier mortuary use. Returning to the stories preserved in the Apophtagmata Patrum, we may suppose that the first inhabitants of this tomb could indeed have slept among mummies. We do not know whether they deliberately challenged their faith in this way, but we do know that they eventually cleaned the tomb of mummified bodies and discarded them in two places, in the shaft and on the slope in front of the entrance to the adjacent tomb further south. Pharaonic debris removed from the tomb was also found in the front of the entrance to MMA 1152. In other words, the creation of the hermitage began with an act of physical and symbolic clearance. The monks had to make the tomb inhabitable, but also ritually and mentally usable as a Christian ascetic space. The earliest evidence for the monastic occupation comes primarily from pottery. Late Roman tableware, including two forms of African red slipware and their imitations, namely Egyptian red slipware A, suggests that the hermitage may have been inhabited from the late 5th century. The main period of activity at the Hermitage is established primarily on the basis of the extensive collection of ostraca and pottery. Both categories of evidence indicate the tomb was inhabited throughout the 6th and 7th centuries and remained in use into 8th century. The end of the main occupation is documented above all through ostraca, which point to activity in the first half of the 8th century. The manuscript finds nuance this picture further. In 2005, 3 Sahidic manuscripts were discovered outside the tomb MMA 1152 on the rubbish dump accumulated on the rocky slope below the courtyard, lying on a thin layer of ash and sealed by a rubble. 2 of them were papyrus codices bound in leather, one containing the canons in Sahidic attributed to Pseudo-Basil, the other an encomium of Byzantius of Coptos. Both are generally placed in the late 7th or 8th century. A third find consisted of parchment cards between wooden boards with excerpts from Isaiah and the Acts of Peter, provisionally dated even later to the 9th or 10th century. The context of these books is difficult to interpret. They may have belonged to the last phase of the Hermitage, or they may have been discarded after the site had already been abandoned and disturbed. But in either case, they show that the afterlife of MMA 1152 was also textual. Nevertheless, the abundance of finds now has to be reconnected with their original context in order to reconstruct the stratigraphy of the site as accurately as possible. The context number by Górecki had to be remapped more precisely, largely on the basis of his fieldwork diaries. These notes were also essential for proposing Harris matrices for several sectors of the site. I am now in the process of establishing the chronological relationship between these sectors, mainly on the basis of the pottery finds. Although I do not expect that everything can be well connected with each other. But yes, and we will see what will be the outcome of that. And I hope to be able to establish, to reconstruct the stratigraphy of the site as in the details in the book. Some of the terms used in Górecki's notes were also quite puzzling and had to be deciphered in order to understand the layout of the site, especially because they often served as location markers. This included expressions such as contemplative seat, red stone, or tea house, known also as a modern kitchen. Górecki devoted much of his intellectual work to identifying and understanding the changing phases of the site. The work, however, was interrupted, and he did not have the opportunity to bring it to completion. What emerges clearly from his notes and plans and from my work that I was doing since 2024 is that the transformation of the tomb into a hermitage was not a single uniform act carried out by one generation. The complex was adapted gradually in response to the changing needs of its inhabitants, and what I would like to discuss further in the monograph, to broader administrative and economic developments taking place across late antique Egypt. The monks used the unfinished pharaonic courtyard as the principal external space of the hermitage. It became the point where access routes, storage, movement, and practical activity converged. The reorganization of the original pharaonic courtyard was shaped largely by the ways in which monks and visitors moved into and through the complex. Path 1, described by Górecki as the representative one, led directly from the bottom of the wadi up to the hermitage. To make this ascent easier, the monks constructed a lower terrace and a flight of stone-paved steps, labeled as M. On the right-hand side, the route was broader and bordered by a substantial wall labeled F. So the wall is here. Built partially of mud brick and partly of stone. Path number 2, which I refer to as an internal route, connected to MMA 1152, the principal dwelling, with MMA 1151, interpreted as the chapel of the hermitage. A visitor approaching from the east who missed the beginning of the path 1 could continue further up the slope and then turn left onto path 2. The boundary of the hermitage was marked here by a stone-built wall labeled K. Closer to the courtyard, path 2 was carefully paved with the selected flat limestone slabs. A third route led from the southern part of the courtyard past the tomb magazine towards the unfinished tomb 4S, which may have served as a temporary shelter. Continuing further down along path 3, one could reach the Valley of the Eagle. The area immediately in front of the entrance to the tomb MMA 1152 was deliberately distinguished from the rest of the courtyard by paving it with carefully selected local silica concretions. These have a distinctive symmetrical form consisting of a torus-like outer element surrounding a centrally positioned spherical body. The natural bedrock surface would have been perfectly adequate for everyday use, yet the monks chose to embellish this particular area, suggesting that the entrance zone was intended to appear more formal or representative. Only after this pavement had been laid did the monks construct a small square unroofed compartment labeled as C against the almost vertical rock face on the northern side. Its precise function remains uncertain, but it was clearly associated with the practical or economic activity. The room had 3 masonry walls, while its floor was paved with the rectangular fired brick tiles, fragments of which are still preserved in situ. An entrance on the northern side led directly toward a deep rock-cut pit, labeled as C1. The slightly sloping stone pavement appears to have directed movement from the doorway towards the feature this feature. The edge of the pit was reinforced with fired floor tiles forming two steps, while parts of its interior were lined with smooth stones, reused Pharaonic bricks, and roughly applied plaster. When this installation is considered together with two similar pits, E1 and E2, cut along the same northern rock face and compared with better known examples elsewhere in Western Thebes, the most plausible interpretation is that this part of the site functioned as a textile workshop. The three pits, loom pits, may have served as a loom pits for the installation of vertical looms. This interpretation also fits well with the textual evidence in which weaving and textile production are repeatedly mentioned as activities undertaken by monks and monastic communities. And we have also around 40 other examples of such loom pits that were archaeologically confirmed in Western Thebes. A third external structure labeled G was a small and poorly preserved room in the southern part of the courtyard. Its construction was much less regular than that of other built features. Two walls were properly built, while the others combined stone blocks and reused bricks, and one contained a very narrow entrance. Traces of burning along the southern wall suggest that the room may have been used for cooking or heating food. However, the archaeological context is extremely poor here, and its date remains uncertain. Another important modification was that the construction of an artificial platform labeled H in the southern part of the courtyard, just where the now tomb magazine is located. Its upper surface was raised to the level of the entrance to a small subsidiary Middle Kingdom tomb. The platform covered an earlier mud storage vessel, pitos, and created easier access to the tomb, as well as a small courtyard in front of it. A low bench was also built here along the edge and could have served both for work and for rest, offering a place where the monk living in the tomb could receive another monk or an outside visitor. One of the most visible monastic interventions was the mud brick tower in front of MMA 1152, labeled as Structure B. When Winlock saw the site, a brick vault above the ground floor and at least one upper story were still preserved. The vault later collapsed, probably by the late 1930s. Tower's original height was at least 6 meters. The ground floor was accessed from the west at a courtyard level, whereas the upper floor must have been reached by the ladder, since no internal or external staircase was found. This arrangement is well documented at other monastic sites, and comparable inaccessible towers can still be seen in Coptic monastic architecture. The tower may therefore have served several functions. It recreated additional storing space, helped control access to the tomb, and, as I have already suggested, may also have reduced the visibility of the large tomb entrance. Górecki's field notes also indicate that the tower was not constructed during the earliest phase of the monastic occupation. After reviewing the stratigraphy, it is clear that it was built over a substantial layer of an earlier rubbish dump. The construction can therefore be dated no earlier than around first half of the 7th century, on the basis of the well-dated Ostrakon el-Gurna Górecki 107, published by Anne Budor, discovered between the upper surface of the earlier rubbish dump and the overlying earthen floor of the tower. Inside the tomb, the organization of space was far from random. The corridor was clearly divided into 3 functionally distinct zones. The front part appears to have served primarily as a sacred and reception-oriented space, and it was therefore the area most extensively transformed by the monks. In the first occupancy phase, this was also the place where monks could sleep. The original entrance to the tomb was narrowed, and a wooden door must have been installed, as a door socket was found still in situ. The floor was carefully paved with the ceramic tiles let in a herringbone pattern directly on the bedrock, which had been first meticulously cleared by the monks. 2 benches were constructed along the southern wall. One was earlier A1, and the latter was the A2 was added later, facing a group of now poorly preserved but once rather elaborate paintings. This included a highly decorative cross with a medallion, another cross painted inside the niche, and a third cross that was later overpainted with the image of a saint warrior holding a sword and riding a horse. At the boundary between the front and the middle section of the corridor was a small entrance leading to the underground rock-cut chamber originally intended for the Middle Kingdom funerary models, labeled as A8. The monks reused it as a storeroom, mainly for water vessels. I would argue that at least in the first phase, this was a rather multi-purpose space, serving both as a sleeping space, as a reception room, as a place of worship, and a place for storing goods. The middle section of the corridor was organized somewhat differently. Here, the walking surface was higher because the monks chose not to remove the post-Middle Kingdom debris that had accumulated during the tomb's earlier funerary use. Instead, they laid a pavement of flat limestone slabs over it, particularly in the front of another Middle Kingdom side chamber intended for models. No significant paintings are preserved in this part of the corridor, although traces of mud plaster survive in several places. The side chamber was closed with a wooden door, and inside it, Górecki's team found more than 20 amphora stoppers suitable for sealing late Roman 7 amphora. This led to the fairly straightforward conclusion that the chamber had served as a wine cellar. It offered naturally favorable conditions. It was shaded, relatively cool, neither excessively dry nor damp, and protected from changes in temperature. The innermost eastern section of the corridor was separated by a mud brick wall that originally reached the ceiling and was closed with a wooden door. Its threshold was made from a reused Pharaonic limestone block. The face of the wall around the doorway was whitewashed, and fragments recovered from the collapse indicate that it also carried a painted yellow-brown guilloche outlined in black or dark gray. One possibility is that the guilloche framed the doorway itself. Another is that the monk left a small, perhaps arch window-like opening above the door to admit a limited amount of light, with the painted guilloche framing this opening instead. These reconstructions, however, are of course highly hypothetical. In either reconstruction, the final section of the corridor formed an entrance hall leading to the monks' sleeping quarters in the chapel. The wall and door provided privacy and protection from the summer heat, the cold of winter, and unwanted intruders such as bats, pigeons, hornets, and other wild animals. The chapel was adopted by monks not earlier than in the 7th century. They created there a sleeping area with 2 low beds, labeled A5, enclosed by mud bricks. They probably laid palm leaf mats directly on the bedrock to provide at least a minimum degree of comfort. They also cut irregular niches into the wall above the beds. This may have supported private prayer, but they could also have held oil lamps. On the eastern wall of the chapel, the monks could cut a much deeper niche labeled A6. It was large enough to accommodate one person lying in an almost fully extended position. Since it was located approximately 1.5 meters above the floor level, it may have served as a sleeping place, protecting its occupant from animals and some insects. It could, however, also have been used for storage. The external part of Hermitage had a strongly practical character. Evidence suggests craft activities, storage of raw materials for the production of mats, textiles, leather goods, and the preparation of food. This is an important counterbalance to the image of the hermit as entirely withdrawn from material life. Even a small hermitage required storage, tools, supplies, maintenance, and perhaps production for exchange. In the earlier phase, we see stronger evidence for spiritual life, prayer spaces, and executing paintings, while in the 7th century, the evidence for the economic and commercial activity became clear, along with more traces of contact between hermitages. The site therefore shows change over time, not just a fixed monastic model. The adaptation of the second nearby tomb may also have reflected this shift in function. In front part of the corridor in MMA 1151, if the front part of the corridor in MMA 1152 did indeed lost its sacral meaning during the later phase, they need to find another place for religious rites and pious meditations. So, therefore, it may lead to the hypothesis that this is why they decided to transform the nearby tomb MMA 1151 into a chapel or oratory. The dating of this transformation is unfortunately difficult to establish because no substantial datable material was found either inside or outside the tomb. There was barely any pottery and only one ostrakon. This lack of evidence is, however, informative in itself. The space was clearly not used as a dwelling or as a place of economic activity. The sacred character the sacred character of the tomb is, on the other hand, beyond doubt, mainly because of the carefully made opus sectile pavement with a large cross placed directly at the entrance of the corridor. The cross was set on a clay bedding and composed of calcite tiles that closely imitated the appearance of the grey marble. Small fragments of red-brown ceramic tiles outlined its shape. Throughout the corridor, monks covered the rock-cut floor with a very high-quality lime mortar, supplemented in places with darker clay. The surface was hard, exceptionally smooth, and sufficiently resistant to moisture to function almost like a waterproof plaster. In 3 places, the mortar contained shallow concave depressions surrounded by clear traces of black soot. These marks show that the monks placed and lit oil lamps beneath the wall paintings. Although the decoration survives only poorly, it included mainly crosses, medallions, and rosettes. Thanks to drawing made by Herbert Winlong's team from the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the beginning of 20th century, we know that 2 benches stood along the eastern wall, separated by a partition wall made of mud bricks. One of the benches was L-shaped. Górecki later identified negative impressions of these structures on the floor. Fragments of painted plaster were also found bearing inscriptions that mention the names Petros and Marcos. Interestingly, the backs of these fragments preserved negative impressions of mud bricks, suggesting that the partition wall itself had carried a longer painted inscription. Several additional fragments may belong to the same text. I am now trying to join them together in the hope of reconstructing a larger part of this inscription. It is impossible to talk about this hermitage without mentioning the textual evidence that was found here. Esther Garel has already published several ostraca, and Anne Boudor wrote 3 extensive articles that were published in JJP journal. And they both shown that through prosopography, paleography, some order can be introduced into this documentation, and at least 2 main phases can be distinguished. The first important dossier belongs to the early 7th century and gathers letters around Ezekiel and Jor. Several of these letters are connected with the priest Victor, superior of the monastery of San Foibamon after Abraham. Some were written by the recognizable hand identified by Krum as that of David, also called D, probably Victor's secretary. Ostraca reveal also some other connections in this time with other monastic sites, such as the Topos of San Mark. The correspondence is mutual because at the Topos of San Mark, an ostracon was found mentioning a camel driver that was obliged to draw water once a month for Apa Ezekiel and Apa Jor, so the inhabitants of MMA 1152, which gives a very concrete glimpse of how Hermitage on the mountain depended on organized supply. The second group can be dated to 8th century, and the content of this ostraca again revealed that the Hermitage MMA was a part of independent monastic network. There are letters about sending or returning books, alphabet exercises, psalms, exercises, accounts, requests for money, letters, protection, and exercise with psalm fragments. And what is also important for the second part of this dossier, dated to 8th century, that we have also connection with that the dweller of this time, Apa Joseph, had the connection with the famous monk Frange from TT 29, which is also nearby. Several generations or groups of monks inhabited the hermitage. It is difficult to determine how many there were or how long each group or couple rather occupied the site. Periods of abandonment may have also be present here, especially between the 7th and 8th century, and have lasted for several years or even to several decades. It seems that we can distinguish at least three and perhaps even four groups of monks. During the first phase, a single monk probably inhabited the hermitage. He had a bench at the beginning of the corridor and slept, or he could also sleep in the rock-cut niche at the back of the chapel. No written sources survive from this period. This may reflect a lack of economic contacts, craft or commercial activity, and cooperation with other hermitages. There is little evidence for any specific craft production. The situation may have been similar in MMA 1151, if it was indeed occupied at the end of 5th century. During the second phase, the hermitage may have housed one monk or possibly two, or if the two external weaving workshops belong to this period. Again, no written sources survived. The reason may have been similar to that proposed for the first phase. Possible activities included weaving and the collection of the red pigment, namely ochre. The third phase, which lasted for a longer period during the first half of the 7th century, was associated with monk Ezekiel and Jor. During this phase, the monks built the tower and separated the sleeping area inside the tomb with a wall. One larger enclosed weaving workshop replaced, maybe, or was added to the two already existing loom pits. Imported written evidence survives from this period, particularly letters sent by Victor from the monastery of San Foibamon. And the monks still practice weaving, basketry, leatherworking, and again, collection of the red pigment and production. The fourth phase was associated with Joseph and belongs to an unspecified period in the first half of the 8th century. Two or perhaps even three monks may then have inhabited the hermitage. During this phase, the monks constructed the platform in the southern part of the courtyard above the pitas and added the second layer of wall paintings, including the Sant Warrior. Their activities may have included weaving, basketry, leatherworking, and again, the collection of red pigment. The absence of written sources from the first period of occupation, probably in the 6th century, may suggest that eremitic life then had a more strongly spiritual character. Significantly, the appearance of numerous texts in the first half of the 7th century coincided with an expansion of the built environment. This may have been connected with the development of craft production and an increase in the monks' income, which allowed them to employ builders to construct the tower and room C, the room C with the loom pit. A major shift in the economic situation of the inhabitants is also suggested by the appearance around the middle of the 7th century of amphora of Tunisian origin. More than 100 such vessels were identified, so these were not accidental finds or small shards collected elsewhere by the monks. They were clearly imported deliberately to supply the hermitage, most probably with olive oil. This all raises the status of the hermitage during this period in comparison with other monastic sites. Such valuable imported commodities have so far been identified only in TT 29 in the Hermitage of Frange and in the monastery of Paul at Dra-Bolnaga. Their presence suggests that these communities possessed substantial financial means and were able to participate in the long-distance trade. I also strongly believe that this hermitage, together with monastery of St. Foibamont, the monastery of Paul, and the Topos of St. Mark, so all the monastic sites that possessed storage space and towers, participated in the redistribution system. These sites were well equipped with storage spaces, which would have allowed them to order larger supplies of products such as wine or olive oil from Tunisia, and then redistribute them among the other monastic communities and individual anchorites. I would like to end by returning from the scale of one hermitage to the wider landscape. The decline of monastic life in Western Thebes cannot be reduced to one cause. The Arab conquest changed the geopolitical setting, but its effects were gradual and uneven. Earlier administrative structures initially continued. Christian institutions could still function, and in some regions, churches and monasteries continued to be founded or supported. Over time, however, the situation became more difficult. New taxes, including taxes imposed on monks, controls on movement, fiscal pressure, and on non-Muslim communities, and wider economic instability all affected monastic communities. The documents from Western Thebes show this in very particular terms. Monks needed permissions to travel, to sell products such as robes, and to move within an increasingly restrictive administrative system. At the same time, we should not imagine a single dramatic collapse. What we see is a long process of decline. Most of the Theban monastic communities disappeared from the sources in the late 8th century. Others survived longer, like the monastery of Paul, and some abandoned sites acquired new art afterlives as a memory sites, like in the monastery of San Foibomon. What other factors may have contributed to the gradual decline of the monastic communities? Could climate changes and their impact on the local environment also have played a role? These are questions that still need to be explored. One thing, however, is certain. Reuse did not end with the abandonment of the monasteries. The Theban necropolis, originally intended as a city of the dead, continued to serve as a city for the living long after monastic life had faded. And this is the last slide, but I have to also mention that, as we all know, excavations are not a one-man task. So the work that I presented here and the work that is still going on would not be possible with the amazing group of people, past and present. And I have to thank first and foremost Artur Obłuski, the director of the PCMA, for entrusting me with this position after Tomasz Górecki passing. And this is obviously truly an honor for me to continue his legacy, because he was also my friend personally, even if I did not know him for such a long time. And my team in 2024 and 2025 was rather small, but very efficient. So good job, guys, if you are here with us. And of course, the majority of the credits goes again to Górecki and his former team members. And I want also to thank my family and my lovely baby boy who was patient enough with his mommy to let me work at the site. So thank you very much.